We're pleased to have the next portion of this program, the authors of this great new book, bestseller, that came out just a few months ago called Justice on Trial. It's an in-depth examination of the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation from just over a year ago, as you all remember. It's a great read. We have copies on sale in the lobby. If you want to stop by and pick up a copy for yourself, because the authors will be sticking around later this evening to sign copies. We're also going to have a breakout session with them. So let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is a senior editor at The Federalist. She's a Fox News contributor. You see her all the time. She's a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, The Washington Post. Please welcome second panelist is Chief Counsel and Policy Director at the Judicial Crisis Network. She's testified before Congress on assorted constitutional issues and briefed senators on judicial nominations. She clerked for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Please welcome Carrie Severino. So let's talk about this bestseller. My first question is, as we've talked to you both on the show about your book when it first came out, part of the reason for writing it was to telegraph what is likely to happen if President Trump gets to nominate another Supreme Court justice candidate. Do you think we'll see a repeat? I mean, you apparently think we're going to see a repeat of what happened to Brett Kavanaugh with respect to another Trump nominee. If Trump isn't reelected, do you see what's happening to Trump now repeating itself under Democrat control of the Oval Office? In other words, are they still intent on trying to remove Brett Kavanaugh from office as soon as from the bench as soon as they have the chance?
Well, it's interesting to note that just before this latest impeachment effort for the president happened, there was actually quite a bit of conversation among Democratic nominees for the presidential, or Democratic candidates for the presidential nomination in support of impeaching Kavanaugh. They were doing this in response to what turned out to be a completely ridiculous report that was debunked by us, actually. But they wanted to do it. And I'm also reminded that the day after the election, I was taking the Acela train back from New York to D.C., and I happened to sit right across from Jerry Nadler, who's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And he revealed in a series of telephone conversations his impeachment plans, which were both about the president and Kavanaugh. They wanted to impeach both of them. So I think, yes, if they were successful in any way with this impeachment process, which remains to be seen, I think that they will do more of what they're successful with. And just an hour ago, Kamala Harris says she wants an investigation into Brett Kavanaugh for unknown reasons. And so I don't think they're stopping, unfortunately.
Yeah. Carrie.
I think it's really two sides of the same coin. Their strategy is to be able to control and dominate the country through the courts, because every time they've been unsuccessful to do it through the elected branches, they've run to the courts, and the courts have been all too willing to give them whatever is on their liberal wish list. And now that they're starting to see the courts fall away from their grasp, they will do anything it takes to get them back. So if they can win the White House and win the Senate and do it by impeaching Kavanaugh, by expanding the size of the court, packing the court with as many liberal justices as they think they can get away with, they will do that. If they could have done it by blocking Kavanaugh's confirmation, they certainly would have done that. And in the absence of being able to block a nominee, what they want to do is exactly what Deborah Katz, Christine Blasey Ford's attorney, said they should do, which is to try to put an asterisk next to his name. So anything he does has been discredited. And that is not a new strategy. As Dan said, I clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. We saw this happen all in 1991 when he was being confirmed. They could not stand the idea of having a strong, principled black conservative on the Supreme Court. And they pulled out all the stops, went to historic lows in trying to block him. And then when they were unable to do so, they engaged in a 30-year propaganda campaign to try to undercut his influence in the court. And that was one of the reasons Mollie and I wanted to write Justice on Trial, because we knew it wouldn't stop then. We knew they were going to continue this process to try to change the narrative. So the people who watched the process, in the case of Thomas or Kavanaugh, saw the inconsistencies in the story, the way it changed, saw that it was completely uncorroborated, saw everyone involved saying, I don't think, everyone who's named as having been there saying, there's nothing like this ever happened. But let me tell you, if they are able to continue this kind of campaign, rewriting history, in 20 years and 30 years from now, people won't remember that. All they'll know is that Christine Blasey Ford is a brave woman who stood for women's rights everywhere, and because that's what they'll have been told. So we wanted to get out front and tell the true story, so they can't do that.
Do you think? Do you think the Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee and in general, do you think they were caught a little bit flat-footed by this? Do you think they've been mugged by the reality of just exactly the lengths to which the left is willing to go when it comes to Supreme Court nominees? Or did you find in your investigating and ultimately the book that you wrote that they saw this coming and were executing a response that they had prepared?
This was some of the more interesting stuff that we did through reporting our book. We interviewed more than 100 people, including lots of people at the White House, up to and including the president, tons of senators, tons of Supreme Court justices. We got some really interesting stories coming out of the Senate, including, I think the big thing that was interesting was the Republican majority at that time was so narrow that there was no room for error. And so anyone going wobbly had a huge effect on things. So one of the stories we tell in the book is about how after the reopened testimony, after Judge Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford testify, and everybody thinks it's just going to go forward to a vote of the whole Senate, Jeff Flake negotiates with Chris Coons. Republican Jeff Flake negotiates with Democrat Chris Coons to have an additional week of investigation. Turned out all right for everybody. An additional week of investigation from the FBI not only revealed no corroboration for any of the increasingly absurd allegations, also showed some evidence of witness tampering and other things that really convinced Republican senators that they were doing the right thing. But they have this meeting, they go into this ante room off the meeting, and people are so upset at how things had deteriorated on the committee that some senators almost come to blows, literal blows. A Republican senator almost decked a Democrat senator because they were so upset about what had happened.
A lot of hips could be broken in a fight like that. Yeah.
So the average age in that room, yeah, who knows what was going on. But I think what you just said in the first question, too, was about what Carrie is talking about, this idea that differences are no longer being settled at the ballot box. And I think that Republicans are finally waking up to the reality of that. I think the Russia hoax, a lot of Republican senators fell for it. By the time of the Kavanaugh thing, many were getting wiser. You see with the Ukraine thing, almost nobody, except for like Mitt Romney, is falling for it. So people are getting wiser and understanding that this is actually a threat to the constitutional system and self-government, and you don't need to play along with the media and the Democrats on what they're doing.
How much, and Carrie, how much did what happened with Christine Blasey Ford, sort of the conspiring, if I could say that, between Dianne Feinstein's office and Blasey Ford's representation, how much of that informed Republicans for what was to come with the Mueller investigation and now Ukraine, as was just mentioned?
Yeah, I think it was so interesting to learn the many ways that the Democrats shot themselves in the foot by overstepping in this process. And we learned, for example, talking to Susan Collins, who all along was known as being a key swing vote in this, right? This is the people they should have been the person they should have been trying to convince. Instead, they're using exactly the wrong tactics, threats and intimidation, and their hyper-partisanship actually alienated the very swing votes they should have been trying to appeal to. So holding on to that letter, for example, for over a month, rather than actually revealing it through the confidential process specifically designed by the Senate to allow investigation of allegations without dragging both the nominee and the accuser into the spotlight. They didn't do that. Repeatedly, Senator Feinstein, or at times it seems even her staff, who was far more radical than she was even, were trying to push them into asking for numbers of documents that were orders of magnitude more ridiculous than anyone could do. So every time they did that, I think it made the Republican senator go, now wait a minute, maybe this isn't really in good faith. And unfortunately, yeah, it does seem like it takes a few more times than it took the rest of us to have to say, these guys aren't being fair. They're not really interested in the answers here. They're really just going for whatever partisan ends they can. But I think finally that did start to come through, and I'm hopeful that that bleeds into these other areas, as Mollie was saying, whether it's Mueller or Ukraine, et cetera.
From all the people you talk to, and you talk about the narrow majority, those swing votes, wobbly Republican senators, what was the turning point for Kavanaugh's confirmation that he was going to be confirmed? Was it his opening statement after Blasey Ford testified? Was it Lindsey Graham's Cross of Gold speech? What was it in your assessment?
I think there were multiple times. I mean, again, the Republican majority was so narrow that you had a lot of ups and downs. We heard from some people that one of the most important things for confirming Kavanaugh was either the second allegation that came out against him or the third. Meaning, when there was just one allegation, it was murky, it was impossible to either prove or disprove. That was shaky. By the time a second one comes out that shows a lot of the same problems with storytelling and there's no corroboration, people start to realize it's an operation. By the time Michael Avenatti comes out with his claim that that Kavanaugh led a serial gang rape cartel through the streets of suburban Maryland, everybody realizes what's going on. And so counterintuitively, I mean, that was part of the operation. In fact, the author of the New Yorker piece said they published this story that was riddled with problems because they wanted to show a pattern. But showing the pattern, again, it was the same thing you saw in the Russia thing. It's the same thing you see in the Ukraine thing. People are starting to get aware, oh, this is a political operation. This isn't about this man who everybody else who knows him says is beyond reproach.
Yeah. It's not really a pattern of how Kavanaugh behaved. It starts to become a pattern of how the Democrats and the media behaved. And when they started to see that, they're like, oh, maybe we don't need to take everything so seriously. And it was actually a good telling thing. Again, if you know your history, you aren't condemned to repeat it, and that's why it's important to know the Kavanaugh history. And we saw during this process the people for whom the Thomas hearings were a really formative time in their life. People like White House counsel Don McGahn, people like Leader McConnell, Chuck Grassley, who was chair of the Judiciary Committee. Those guys were in the Senate at the time. Those people, I think, saw the writing on their wall earlier because they'd already seen exactly this playbook done before. And oddly, it was some of the younger senators, even some conservative senators. We found one who actually tried to get the president or was trying to get Susan Collins to help get the president pull Kavanaugh in the middle of that hearing with Christine Blasey Ford saying, actually, maybe now is our good opportunity to switch out for another nominee. I think those senators hopefully have learned now after this process, guys, this is a regular playbook they go back to. You can't take it seriously like you would if it was a real, just an allegation motivated by something that really happened versus a clear political play.
Who is that senator?
We are not disclosing, but
okay, all right.
Perhaps not who you would think it was, is all I'll say.
Yes.
That points to another issue, though, which is that there were a lot of people who went wobbly right after Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. A lot of normal Americans didn't find it compelling at all. But inside that DC bubble, people found it profoundly compelling. We reviewed how the media covered it at every media outlet. They said, well, in a way, when she contradicts herself, that makes her more convincing. There was just this other thing that was happening. So I do think it was shaky right after that. And the fact that so many people did stay strong, and to be candid, the White House was very strong throughout the whole process. And we go through the history of previous Republican presidents that did not show that steadiness with their nominees, or who signaled, well, if you're not going to vote for this person, we'll pull them and put someone else. And that didn't happen. And so I think the White House, the president, Don McGahn, the majority leader in the Senate, there were some pretty key figures who were unshakable.
One of the other key parts of your book is to address the mantra of the Democrats during this process, which is, what do they have to lose? What do they have to gain? They have nothing to gain here. They have only things to lose. What is Christine Blasey Ford? What is Deborah Ramirez? What is even Julie Swetnick, who is represented by Avenatti, you remember? What do they have to gain from this? And you answer that question.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a list, all of which was intentionally obscured in their presentation. For example, Christine Blasey Ford was presented by the media as someone who's kind of, maybe dabbles in looking at political things, not really that interested. We talked to people familiar with her social media pages before they were professionally scrubbed and said, actually, yeah, she was crazy liberal. I mean, this is someone who's very liberal. So there's political things to gain.
And as you referenced, her attorney later admitted they did it because they were motivated by abortion.
Absolutely. And she said that she specifically said, I think that was motivating Christine as well. And, there's been further reporting that we have done and others have done since then that shows there's a lot of people around her as well who were like, hey, we got to get this story front and center. The way it was rolled out clearly is we need to do this in the most political way possible, from the idea of having it as a public hearing rather than private, because that's the one that's most likely to move the votes. But look at where Christine Blasey Ford is literally today. She was just giving a speech, I think at the YWCA. Sports Illustrated has rolled her out as someone to introduce Rachel Down Hollander, the woman who accurately blew the whistle on the hundreds of abuse and rape amongst Michigan State athletes. She was listed as Time's 100 most important women in America. The GoFundMe to pay for her security was over $1 million.
Close to $1 million.
Right. So, I mean, this is, and allegedly the extra costs are being donated to charity. There's no evidence of how that has happened before. And I continue to, I know it's like I keep on going back to Thomas and Hill, but where is Anita Hill now? She is still a national figure. She's still trumpeted throughout the country as someone who is a woman to look up to everywhere. Her career following that day her career already up until that moment in her life was really being helped along by Clarence Thomas at every way of step of it. But after, trying to attack him, she then became a national figure and a celebrity. That's what's happening.
Joe Biden has to apologize
I know.
to her today, right?
3 decades later. So
I just
this is
want to
happening to
add,
Ford as
though, we judged everything by whether there was evidence for allegations or not even about all these other things. There's no evidence that Christine Blasey Ford ever met Brett Kavanaugh, much less that anything as she described happened. And I think it's important to just remember that we should have standards. That's one of the things that we focused on in the book, was the whole notion of justice itself being on trial. And we also told the story of Leland Kaiser, her lifelong best friend, who, when she first heard that she was supposedly at this event where this happened, she felt horrible. She wanted to help her friend, and she felt horrible that she hadn't helped her out. And as she spends weeks under the public eye and she's trying to think through when this could have been, and her friend is offering no answers about where it was, when it was, how it happened, how she got there, she starts to remember that summer in question extremely well. I mean, it was a very formative summer for her. It was the summer she started golfing, and she goes on to become a quasi-professional golfer. And she comes to basically doubt her friend's story completely and ends up telling the FBI that, and that she'd been pressured to change her story by mutual acquaintances. These are things that the media don't like to highlight that happened. So it's not just that there's no evidence in favor, there's a lot of evidence against it as well.
And if you want someone who really had nothing to gain, that's Leland Kaiser,
Right.
because she herself was liberal, did not want Kavanaugh on the court, and had lost many friends in the process who, as Mollie said, were pressuring her to change her story, and even threatening to reveal damaging information about her own struggles with addiction in her past. I mean, so her whole life was thrown into disarray because of this. And at the end of the day, she did not make $1 million on GoFundMe.
Speaking of overreaching, blowing up in the face of the Democrats, 2 New York Times reporters write a book about Kavanaugh, the education of Brett Kavanaugh, and the portion that's excerpted in the New York Times includes a portion of what's reported to be a new allegation against Kavanaugh, and of course explain how that played itself out and the quality of the reporting of those 2 New York Times reporters, and how much they've helped your book sales.
Yeah, we wrote the book in part because we knew there would be books coming out that tried to rewrite the history. We knew we had really good access to all sorts of people at the White House, Supreme Court, Senate, and whatnot. But that first book that came out was this one by 2 New York Times reporters, and they excerpted this thing that claimed there was this utterly bizarre and physically improbable allegation that I won't get into. But they excerpt it without revealing a few important things. The alleged victim, if you could call her that, had never claimed that anything had happened and had never talked to the reporters and had communicated through multiple friends that she had no recollection of any such event like the ones they were describing. They forgot to mention that the person making the allegation was not just a person of the left, a liberal, but also someone whose wife had not been seated as a judge when she was nominated by Obama. And the seat is now filled by a Trump appointee who happens to be someone who was friends with Brett Kavanaugh. And all these different conflicts of interest, they just didn't include the basic facts, the conflicts, and yet for 2 days, I think it took close to 2 days for the New York Times to acknowledge these failures and put forth a correction. And in that time, the calls to impeach Kavanaugh went crazy, and it's just the same pattern we see in how the media manipulate information, leave out exonerating details, and do it over and over again because unfortunately they're not held accountable enough.
Mm-hmm. And that was the episode in that book that got the most play, but Mollie and I, having read through the entire thing and thankfully having had an early copy to be able to do so, were able to debunk this early on. Otherwise, can you imagine, that's what happened in 24 hours after this was out there. Their book didn't come out for several days, so there would have been no chance to actually fact check it if we hadn't had that early copy. And we have a dozen single-space pages of errors with that book. So this is the kind of hit jobs that we're going to keep on seeing.
One of the other things. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It really did help us with our book sales even more. When we came out, our book was #1. It's great. We're very happy. They worked really hard, and thank you everyone for buying it. But these two authors worked very hard to keep that book secret, and I think they've got to probably not like Carrie or myself because not only did we write the book that kind of pre-debunked everything they were saying, we then were the two people in the country, the only two people to get advance copies without having to sign non-disclosures. So we are the ones who exploded their false narrative in the pages of the New York Times. So I'm a little nervous if we meet them that they might not be pleased with us.
It could be awkward.
Since so much of this is viewed through the prism of sort of feminist politics, one of the things that's interesting to me too, that's sort of forgotten, is it's one thing to the assessments of the character and truthfulness of the accusers. What about all of the women who worked with Brett Kavanaugh professionally? You probably know some of them, Carrie. They're probably colleagues of yours inside the Beltway, who did this remarkable press conference. Something like 200 women who had known Brett Kavanaugh through his coaching, through his work in the legal profession, as a judge, subordinates, colleagues. Remarkable press conference. All of these women, professional, successful women, and it's just dismissed. It got almost no play, no attention. All of those women are supposed to be just shunted aside.
Yeah, I mean, you said one of their mantras was, why would anyone make this up? The other mantra was, believe all women. And it just is an illustration of, they didn't really mean believe all women, they mean believe women that agree with us, and don't believe the 85 women at that press conference who had known him, some of them since high school, some of them during this college, going throughout his entire life, who said, this is not the man that we knew. It was really interesting hearing about one of those women who was so, and many of them were attacked and had issues with even with their jobs. One had to go to the heads of several boards that she was on saying, I really need to stand up for this man. I know him. I know what they're doing is not fair, but I just want to let you know I'm ready to resign if it hurts our company's board. And having to go repeatedly to several different people saying that. And we say in the book, gosh, she didn't even need to bother because it turns out the coverage was utterly nil. They wanted to ignore it completely because they didn't want to have to address that aspect.
But we also talked to people who said that they learned that if they were doing interviews about Brett Kavanaugh, they had to do them live, because if they were recorded, the media would just not feature what they were saying if it was positive toward him. So they started only accepting interview requests if they knew it was being broadcast live, because otherwise they were completely hidden from public view.
One of the things I like to do is address critics, right? Give people the opportunity to address critics so people hear the contention side by side, the accusation and the response, sort of like what you did with your investigation. So I threw a dart at the board of all the Empire media outlets in D.C. to find a book review of your book. This is from Sarah Jones in New York Magazine. Here's the assertion she makes. I mean, it's extensive, her assertions, but this is, I think, the gist of it. She basically says that your book is not about just defending Brett Kavanaugh. It's about trying to delegitimize and effectively eliminate the free press. Listen to what she writes here. Not kidding. New York Magazine, this is, for smart people. She writes about Kavanaugh, and she quotes you, Mollie. It can happen, it does happen, and it just happened, meaning the smear campaigns that drive people from public life. The big unknown is whether America will let it happen again. Hemingway and Severino would rather it didn't. They prefer gentle coverage, a tamed public square. The price of their desired order is the free press.
We prefer fair coverage, and that's something that's very threatening, I guess, to people who would rather tell one side of the story. But Mollie, this is your wheelhouse.
Right, but it's just a common thing you hear. I love, by the way, that she can criticize us without that being a threat to the free press. But if we criticize her, then that's a threat to the free press. In fact, freedom of the press is bundled up with freedom of speech, and media criticism is an important part of having a free press. We unfortunately have a media that have gone from mere bias into outright corruption, and this is not something that's good for anyone. It's actually not good for the media. It's not good for us to not be able to trust what people say or to hold people accountable. That's a decision that they made. Nobody could look at what happened in the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh and think that the media were disinterested people, that they were trying to cover the story accurately or fairly. We look at how, there was this thing called Kavanaugh scandals that trended on Twitter because I think it was the Washington Post or ProPublica had done this expose about how he liked baseball and he'd bought baseball tickets on his credit card. And the scandals that were put forth were he failed to turn on his lights in the rain, or he'd missed one of his daughter's recitals. But people should remember that these problems with the media predated these allegations that came out. But once the allegations came out, there really were not attempts made to tell the story accurately or fairly. And it's not just with him. It's something we've seen, whether it's the Covington boys or, again, the Russia story or other stories. We see, unfortunately, way too much media failure, and it's not going well for them.
And the last question, all the people you interviewed, did you have the chance to meet Squee? Because I really want to learn more about Squee, Brett Kavanaugh's friend circle there.
Unfortunately, we can't talk about all the people. We talked to 30 people on background, but yeah, certainly it says something about our process when we all can recite Brett Kavanaugh's entire high school yearbook and all of his best friends. So if you're thinking of being nominated to the Supreme Court, call your high school friends now.
Right, and
clear
see who signed your yearbook, right? Yeah, and just one thing too. Thinking about this, after the dust had settled and he was confirmed, for some of the critics, some of the people that were weak-kneed, all the people you spoke with again for the book, any recriminations expressed? Did people learn any lessons, or is it just, well, that's another saga that's now concluded, on to the next one?
One of our concerns was the lack of accountability for what happened. We just talked about the media, but there were criminal referrals made for some of the people who made false allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, but the Justice Department hasn't done anything about that. You had demonstrably unethical behavior from several senators, whether it was Dianne Feinstein not running the process through the approved Senate process for handling allegations such as this, or Cory Booker releasing committee confidential documents in his Spartacus moment. And nothing has happened to them or the attorneys who lied to Christine Blasey Ford by her own admission. And what I think is worrisome about that is when people aren't held accountable, there's no reason for it to not happen again. And it will happen again precisely because they can get away with it.
Mollie Hemingway, Carrie Severino, the authors of Justice on Trial. Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you. Thank you.